Today's story is about the longest ruling queen in Indian history. Her name was Chennabhairadevi, but her Portuguese enemies called her the Pepper Queen. Welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Thenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. In today's episode, we are dipping into history. We've covered a fair bit of mythology and folklore, but we have also covered a number of historical characters. Today's story is about one such person, Queen Chennabhairadevi. She wasn't just an ordinary queen. This queen ruled for 54 years, which is a remarkably long period given the life expectancy of people in 16th century India was much lower than that. Normally, we might do a little bit of a biographical introduction to the main character, where they were born, how they grew up, but that might make me sound like a Wikipedia article. So let's hear it all from the perspective of two Portuguese businessmen. Let's call them Empresario Expositor and Aprende Expositor. No relation, despite the same last names. We are just following the tradition of naming the characters based on the roles they play. Empresario literally means businessman in Portuguese, and aprendiz is apprentice. Expositao is the Portuguese word for exposition, because that is what these two gentlemen were about to do. Are we almost there yet? Asked Aprende. Relax, Empresario said, still patiently, though this was the 100th time he had been asked. He demonstrated much more patience than any driver in a modern family on a road trip. I'm getting worried, Aprende added. This is my first business trip. I was commissioned to buy 100 tons of pepper from this Saluva kingdom. And if we reach late, there might not be any pepper remaining. Relax, Empresario said again. You have to learn, my boy. There are no other ships. We have complete and total control of the Indian coastline. We have a monopoly, practically. We are going to completely and utterly dominate the natives. There's no one else here. I'm not worried about European competition, Aprende clarified. What's to stop other Indian kingdoms from buying all the pepper that the Saluva kingdom makes? Two things, Empresario said. One, they're too scared of us. We burnt down their capital at Bhatkal. We disposed of the previous king and queen there. We'll get cooperation from this new ruler. whoever they are. And two, they fight too much. They're constantly at war with their neighbors. That works very well for us. Divide and conquer and all that. Though it might be the English who trademarked that term. And if we need a show of force, nothing to worry about. We've got the nation's best and brightest here with us. Admiral Gama de Vasco. Empresario was right on the second point. The Saluva kingdom was indeed constantly fighting off challenges from some of the other neighboring kingdoms. There was little to no chance that they would sell all their pepper stock by land. But the businessman was completely wrong about the first point. He was factually correct that soldiers on the previous Portuguese ship had indeed burned down the capital city. But where he was wrong was that the new ruler would be a pushover. They were going to find out pretty soon. For now, though, Empresario licked his lips at the mouth-watering prospect of going home with another cargo full of pepper. Splendid thing, this. Pepper, I mean, he told his apprentice. There is so much demand for it all over Europe. People are using it to do their laundry, to polish their shoes, to melt winter snow on the carriage roads. The next thing you know, they might do something utterly crazy with this pepper, like sprinkling it in their soup or something. That's another thing that he was right about. But let's cut over to the negotiating table. Apprende and Empresario, along with a bunch of officers, sat on one side. The other side of the table was empty. The Portuguese delegation had waited for an hour and they were running out of patience. But what could they do? The butler who had ushered them in could not speak any Portuguese or English. He just smiled at their every word and got them more food and water whenever they tried various mimes. Empresario was the only one in the delegation who seemed relaxed. And that gave his apprentice some measure of confidence. The experienced businessman calmly addressed the butler. All right, let's start at the basics, shall we? Portuguese is a Western Romance language of the Indo-European language family, and it originated in the Iberian Peninsula of Europe. The butler seemed engaged in this lesson, but Portuguese 101 would have to wait, because finally a translator showed up and announced the entrance of the Rani. The Portuguese had no idea what a Rani was, and when they found out that it meant a queen, they were surprised. Where's the king? Admiral Gama de Vasco demanded. Don't know, don't care, Rani Chennabhairadevi said as she entered. And if you're sensible, you won't care either. The admiral drew himself up to his full 6'4" and looked across the table at the lone woman who sat there calmly. What nonsense is this? We keep our women in the kitchen, he said proudly. Evidently, the Rani replied. Anyway, if you'd rather deal with a man, I must bid you farewell. I would say it's been a pleasure doing business with you gentlemen, but I'd be wrong on all three counts there. It wasn't a pleasure. we haven't done business, and you aren't gentlemen." She got up to leave. "Wait, Your Majesty! Don't go, please." Empresario intervened. "I know we got off to a rough start. You said some things, we said some things, but you have to understand, we've had a long journey, and the Admiral is tired. But it's all water under the bridge now. Faults on both sides and all that. Let's talk shop." The pepper was too valuable, and the Portuguese had to have it. And the Queen knew that. The wait, the non-Portuguese butler assignment, they were both deliberate. They were part of the setup. The psychological pressure during these negotiations had started long before the Queen had even arrived at the negotiating table. Rani returned slowly to the table with a reluctant air that said, "Hey, I'm just doing this to be a nice host." That was the point where the businessman took over, and the Admiral took a backseat in the negotiations. Gama de Vasco had been instructed to intervene only if the business dealings took a very unfavorable turn. Empresario, despite his experience, was finding it hard against the tough-as-nails Rani. "We can take the 100 sacks you have right now, and we'll buy as many futures and options as you can manage. But you have to give us a fair market value on those. 2,000 gold coins for a sack of pepper is on the pricey end. We destroyed this kingdom the last time we were here. That entitles us to at least a 20% conqueror's discount. Wouldn't you agree, Admiral?" The thinly veiled threat was the Admiral's cue to nod his head vigorously, and to point out that the previous king who had been defeated was Rani's younger sister's husband. That should get them an additional 5% discount for deep personal connection. 25% isn't a very round number, so let's just bring it up to 30%, he added. "Of course, if you don't believe it was us that destroyed your sister's and brother-in-law's kingdom, I have a certificate somewhere. I bet it's in the hold of my ship, amongst 250 of the latest model Fort Master 1600 cannons, specifically adapted to destroying Indian coastal forts." That sort of a threat might have worked on a lesser queen. "Ooh, nice. I've always wanted to have some of those cannons as decorations in the palace," she said. "But I've never felt like paying the hefty price tag. I was telling my minister the other day, the only way I'm getting one is if I can capture a few as spoils of war. Now, speaking about the discounts, the best I can do is a 1% discount. That's because I have a coupon left over from Diwali. I know Diwali was over a few weeks ago, but just between you and I, who's to know that we hadn't locked in the Diwali special rate for you? Now, let me find it. I knew it was somewhere here, right next to this letter from the Adil Shah of the Bijapur Sultanate, promising me 10,000 infantry and cavalry men. Or maybe the coupon is next to this invoice for 600 custom-built shipmaster cannons, specifically adapted for land-to-sea warfare. Gama de Vasco's heart skipped a beat. Not Adil Shah? The bane of the baptizers? The fright of the foreigners? The one who eats Portuguese for breakfast and the French for lunch? Yup, that was the same Adil Shah that Chennabhairadevi had in mind. And just because she liked seeing how nervous the admiral had become, she threw in a 10% markup on her extremely low prices, just to sweeten the deal. Only for her people, of course. The Portuguese delegation didn't need their deals to be sweetened. They were looking to buy spices, after all. The Portuguese delegation returned. Everyone was especially quiet. Even when the apprentice innocently asked Impresario if they had completely and utterly dominated the natives yet. The Portuguese knew that they were beaten. But these admirals are made of stern stuff. It's not like them to forget and forgive a personal humiliation. A humiliation of the country, maybe, but not personal humiliation. Lots of time passed. And then, finally, the admiral was going to scratch his 7-year itch. And when I say 7-year itch, that's not a reference to the myth that happiness in marriage begins to decline after a specific number of years. And it's also not a reference to the old Hollywood movie of that same name. It's just that it had been exactly 7 years since Chennabhairadevi rose to the throne. It was 7 years since she sat across a table of 20 experienced military and businessmen and given them a schooling. What made it worse in the misogynistic admiral's mind was that she was a woman. He'd never hear the end of it down in the boys' club. The admiral had spent these 7 years building up his forces, and he hoped that there wouldn't be a regime change in Suvail, so he could personally wipe the smile off of Rani Chennabhairadevi's face. To his surprise, though, it was his own country that had a new ruler. The outgoing king was John III, also nicknamed the colonizer. His political stance suited Admiral Gama de Vasco just fine. The new king was called Sebastian I, and he was nicknamed the Sleeping King. That title alone had not raised the admiral's hopes very much, but ironically, it was the Sleeping King that supplied the extra arms and ships that the admiral asked for. Now, I'd like to say that the admiral needed to convince the king of a financial outcome from launching a war against the queen. The cost of pepper would drop to almost nothing, and they would get a bunch of free labor and so on, and their churches would have a lot more members and donors. But that's not the line the admiral took to convince his king. You see, Sebastian I was the grandson of John III, the previous king. And Sebastian I was 3 years old. I'm not sure what the turning point was in the mind of little Sebastian I. Maybe the admiral only had to offer a lollipop. Come to think of it, the name Sleeping King makes more sense now that you realize he was just a toddler. Anyway, toddler or not, the cannons in the admiral's warships were definitely not toys. The admiral lashed out. 7 years of bottled up rage was letting itself out now. And while he was letting out bottled up rage, his warships were letting in water. He sighed as he realized that some of the shots he had heard weren't echoes of his cannons. The enemy had retaliated almost immediately. Chennabhairadevi hadn't simply been twiddling her fingers these last 7 years, as the admiral had secretly hoped. She had invested in having guards keep watch on the coast, night and day. At the first sight of the gunports being opened on the Portuguese ship, they had sounded the alarm. Within seconds of the first cannon being fired at them, they had fired back. There are many ways that a warship can overpower a coastal fort, and most of those rely on the element of surprise. The admiral was in deep trouble now, and embarrassment too. It was one thing for a soldier to face an honorable end on the battlefield. It was another to be hauled out of the water in a fishing net by his enemies. And to add insult to that injury, a couple of fishermen casually remarked that the admiral wasn't even fit for the chum bucket. Gama de Vasco complained bitterly at the negotiating table. Couldn't these natives just understand? He was trying to bring the finest bits of Western civilization for them. He was trying to make the Queen's life better. She didn't have to accept conversion herself, but must she keep building all those places of worship for the locals? If she just stopped, there'd be so much progress. In time, her kingdom would become the melting pot of Indians and foreigners alike, particularly the part in the north with the nice beaches. What was it called? He seemed to have forgotten. Goa, she reminded her guest. But they should probably get on with it. She didn't have time for all this silly banter. She was late to a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and it wasn't a particularly important one. In fact, it was going to be positively boring. But she didn't want to keep him long. So, could he just sign on the dotted line on this new treaty? And then, him and his ship could set sail on the evening tide, which was excellent to launch the sailboats that they were lending him for a massive premium. And of course, the new treaty had spiked pepper prices too. You could say that the Rani had liberally peppered the treaty with taxes and fees. There was the invasion tax and invasion repulsion tax at 100% each. The admiral said that he was extremely annoyed at having to pay 200% more. And then the Queen clarified that 200% wasn't quite it. The invasion repulsion tax applied on top of the new amount, including the invasion tax. So it really was 300% more. Don't they teach basic math in military school? She asked him sweetly. The Portuguese delegation returned, defeated once again. In that delegation was a priest. He had been brought along with promises of millions of Indians ripe for conversion. Despite the unexpected loss, the priest wasn't left completely idle either. He performed the last rites for the fallen soldiers. It took a while. There were a lot of soldiers. If the admiral had given up at that point, things would have been okay for him. He would have gotten a comfortable desk job back home, or maybe operating the ferry to some nearby islands. But it was his own stubbornness that made him try again. This time, he had to wait longer. 11 more years. By then, he had acquired enough reputation back. And being in a society that didn't have too much of a dependence on written record, his past failures were forgotten, as more and more of his colleagues and superiors began to retire. And so it was that in 1570, Admiral Gama de Vasco set out with a fresh set of warships. This time, they were cleverly disguised as cargo ships. The plan was for the soldiers to stay hidden in the hold of the ships. At night, they would emerge stealthily and take over the fort. Should be a very quick victory, the admiral thought. It did not work. What stopped them was just a clever observation by the port worker that these ships weren't as empty as they should have been. The Portuguese should have been bringing a tiny bit of gold by weight compared to the amount of pepper that they were hauling away. So why were these ships so weighted down? He raised the alarm secretly. The admiral had been correct about a quick victory, but the winner wasn't the side that he might have preferred. Rani Chennabhairadevi's soldiers had no trouble in wrapping up victory. It was easier when they discovered that all they had to do was to use some bellows to spread the pepper around the hold. A soldier who is constantly sneezing is not very good at combat, as the admiral discovered that night. That was yet another defeat for the Portuguese. Ultimately, though, the businessman, Empresario, was proved right. It was the infighting that brought down Rani Chennabhairadevi's kingdom. For too long, she had been resisting the aggressions of the Keladi and the Bilagi kingdoms nearby. And she might have gone on resisting had the two kingdoms not joined forces. Chennabhairadevi was captured and jailed, and she passed away in captivity. A few notes. Chennabhairadevi's legacy is largely forgotten these days, but having ruled for 54 years makes her one of the longest rulers in India, and certainly the Indian queen with the longest rule. The Portuguese called her Raina Da Pimenta, which literally means the pepper queen. In case it wasn't obvious, Gama de Vasco is a figment of my imagination. A lot of the details in this story are murky. Though I know exactly what happened there, I'm going to hold my tongue. Historians are confused enough as it is about what exactly happened there. Many of the relics of her capital city survive to this day along coastal Karnataka and South Goa. There are some links to these places in the show notes on the site sfipodcast.com. Check them out. In the next episode, we'll talk about an avatar of Vishnu that does not get as much attention as the other, more popular Dashavatar or 10 avatars. We are going to talk about Hayagreev. This avatar of Vishnu is part human, part horse, but not exactly a centaur. Quite the opposite, in fact. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. I can't directly reply to the questions there, but I'll address them here on this show. Samay, Rez, Vaishnavi, Juhi, and Vamsi, thank you again for the feedback and heartwarming comments. Juhi, I agree. I share your excitement. It's been an interesting journey, and we've all together gotten this far in the Ramayana. We are just about at the point of the main battle now. Vamsi, thank you for the suggestion. I'll cover that in a future episode. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com, or tweet at sfipodcast, or reply to the questions on Spotify's Q&A. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.